Janiel Campbell. I'm a medical doctor, and today we're going to talk about some of the top cancer screening methods that we utilize in Jamaica. Alright, so first let us discuss what exactly is screening. So screening, these are basically tools that are aimed at identifying diseases that are present before there's actually any signs or symptoms. So the person has no signs, no symptoms, but a screening test is able to detect the onset of a disease based on the changes identified. So we're going to talk about screening as it relates to the top 3 cancers. We're going to divide them into male versus female. So the females, we're going to discuss screening related to breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and cervical cancer. So breast cancer accounted for 25.3% of new cases last year. Colorectal cancer in females accounted for 14.9% of new cases, and cervical cancer accounted for 12.6% of new cases last year. So let's start with breast cancer. So screening for breast cancer, it's recommended that we start at 40 years and over. And the screening test that is recommended is a mammogram. So a mammogram is basically a test. It's basically a low-dose X-ray of the breasts. And what will happen is that the lady will go for the mammogram, and her breast will be placed on some plates that will kind of squash the breast. It's really just to even out the breast tissue so that the X-ray can be taken and a good picture can be taken of the breast. So a mammogram can identify changes in the breast architecture that otherwise wouldn't even be palpable or noted, right? So it's recommended that ladies do their mammograms every year, once per year. All right. So there are certain exceptions. Over 40 is recommended for persons with average risk. But if you have a very strong family history of like breast cancer, right, you would start screening earlier. So I would recommend that you speak to your family physician about when screening should start for you.
Okay.
All right. So where can you do a mammogram in Jamaica? You can contact Jamaica Cancer Society. They do mammograms there, as well as other places that do X-rays usually accommodate mammograms, right? And you don't need a referral letter if you're over 40. You can just go to Jamaica Cancer Society and request to do your mammogram, and you get your mammogram done.
Okay.
So we're gonna move on to colorectal cancer.
Yeah, what exactly is that one?
So colorectal cancer is basically cancer found anywhere along the rectum and the colon. These are organs within your digestive system, right? And it's a very prevalent cancer as noted before. So the screening test recommended for colorectal cancer is a colonoscopy, right? And a fecal occult blood test. Colonoscopy, both screenings start at age 50 and over, right? A colonoscopy is usually done every 10 years, right? So you only have to go through that experience every 10 years. And the fecal occult blood is recommended yearly. So what is a colonoscopy? A colonoscopy is where a scope is passed through the rectum or through the back passage up into the colon through the entire length with a camera attached. So basically you can have direct visualization of what is going on. Right? Fecal occult blood test is just a testing of the stool sample. So you pass your stool, you take it to the lab, and they test it for blood that is otherwise not visible. So you wouldn't see this blood in the stool grossly. So they do special tests in the lab to see if there's any blood at all, because sometimes these cancers have bleeding, and that's one of the first signs for some of them.
Yes.
So a colonoscopy can be done again in the private sector. Certain places like Winchester, Medical, Apex, they offer colonoscopies. But the fecal occult blood, usually most labs, private labs, micro labs or biomedical, they offer fecal occult blood testing.
Okay.
All right. So we're gonna move on. We're gonna move on to cervical cancer.
Yes.
Cervical cancer, as we know, is very common in our population, but the good thing about cervical cancer is that changes, even though they start early, they take a long time to develop. Sometimes you may notice a change and it may take up to 3 to 7 years before that change actually becomes cancer. So the screening test for cervical cancer is a pap smear.
Yes.
So a pap smear is where a lady goes. The doctor or the technician uses a speculum, which is a metal instrument, to open the vaginal vault, right? It may be uncomfortable, but it doesn't last for long. Once the cervix is visualized, usually cells are taken from the cervix either by scraping off a little, which is not, it's uncomfortable, but it's quick.
It's a little uncomfortable.
Right, and or a brush is used. It's placed on a slide that goes off to the lab, and they can actually look at these cells at the lab, and the changes are noted. If there are changes, these changes occur gradually that may become cancer. So if there are any changes like that, interventions can be done from early.
Yes.
All right, so that's a good thing about cervical cancer screening. Pap smears are recommended from as young as 21 up to 75 years.
Okay.
So provided that the individual is sexually active, from age 21 to 29 is recommended doing a pap smear every 3 years. And between 30 and 65, it's also recommended to do every 3 years or every 5 years if there's co-testing. So co-testing is basically those cells that they took off for the pap smear. Sometimes they can test it for a virus called HPV, which is human papilloma virus,
yeah.
and that's the main risk factor for developing cervical cancer. So if that resource or those resources are available, that can also be done.
So once the person is not sexually active, they don't need to do the test once every year?
Right, so if somebody isn't sexually active, it's not really necessary for them to do a pap smear for more reasons than one. Because if you're not sexually active, you have a lower chance of being infected with HPV virus in any case, right? And for somebody who is not sexually active, a pap smear would be even more traumatic for that person.
Yes.
Right, so it's not usually recommended. So now we're going to move on to our gentlemen, right? So the cancers that will be, or the screening tests that we'll be discussing will be geared towards prostate cancer, right, lung cancer, and colorectal cancer. So prostate cancer in men accounted for 37.5% of new cases last year.
Yes.
Lung cancer accounted for 11.2% of new cases last year. And colorectal cancer in men accounted for 10.9% of new cases last year. Now, we already discussed colorectal cancer. It's basically the same screening tests that are used, so we won't go into colorectal cancer again. But for prostate cancer, screening is a bit controversial, because prostate cancer grows at a very slow rate and it's very, very popular in our population.
Yeah.
But what is recommended is to do a blood test, a PSA blood test, or prostate specific antigen, right? It's basically a simple blood test, like how you do other blood tests. The blood is drawn, sent to the lab, and you test for this substance, PSA. So that's recommended to start at the age of 50, and thereafter you do it every 1 to 2 years. I must mention about a digital rectal exam. It's not necessarily a screening test, but it's often done by clinicians in elderly men to test kind of for any changes that could be prostate cancer. So what it is, it's basically a finger is inserted in the rectum, in the back passage.
Whoa.
And what we're feeling for is any change in how the prostate feels. Right, so based on what is going on, the prostate is usually smooth, but if there's prostate cancer or other diseases, there may be a change in how it feels. Again, it's not necessarily a screening test, but it's often used. All right, so we're moving on to lung cancer. Just want to say, if you're a smoker, please stop. Like now, like today, please stop. If you look at almost every cancer, there is everything bad, there is every disease. You look at it somewhere in the risk factor, you will see smoking. So if you're a smoker, please stop. And if you're serious about stopping, there are actually ways that you can get help, right? Again, I mentioned Jamaica Cancer Society has certain programs in place to help minimize or to help with smoking cessation. You can also visit the National Council on Drug Abuse's website, and they have different avenues that you may use to help with smoking cessation. It even goes further, where there are medications that can be used to help with smoking cessation. So lung cancer screening is recommended in the ages 55 to 80 years in persons with a very strong history of smoking.
Yes.
So you've smoked probably a pack of cigarette which has 20 for like 30 years. You have a very significant history of smoking, right? Persons who still currently smoke as well are eligible for screening. And the screening is basically a low dose CT chest
Yes.
that they utilize. So again, the most important thing to say about lung cancer, even more than screening, is to stop smoking.
Yes.
Even though I should mention there are persons who have gotten lung cancer who have never smoked a day in their lives.
But the second-hand smoking will
Even persons who haven't been exposed to secondhand smoking have gotten lung cancer. There's still much research to be done in terms of what those persons' risk factors are, but there are persons who have gotten it without smoking or even being exposed to secondhand smoking. But smoking remains the most formidable risk factor for lung cancer.
And it doesn't matter if you're smoking cigarettes or marijuana, ganja.
Well, it's mostly cigarettes and tobacco,
So I
but
can smoke the
I
weed.
am not encouraging
I can smoke the
anybody
weed.
to smoke anything at all. Not paper, not bush, not grass, not marijuana, nothing at all, because all of those have their negative effects that they can have and associated diseases.
So
but
no
it's most
smoking period.
no smoking period, please. So that concludes our discussion for today. I hope everyone learned something, and I hope if you're eligible for any of these screening tests, that you schedule your appointment, see your doctor, and get on top of it pronto. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you next time.
All right, thanks.
Again.